The year was 1903. The town of Fairview, nestled deep within the rolling, fog-kissed hills of upstate New York, was not known for its industry, but for its silence. A silence broken only by the chirping of crickets, and more recently by the hushed, anxious whispers surrounding the Lennox family. The Lennoxes were the embodiment of the era's gilded promise. Elias Lennox, a man of stern, precise demeanor, had built a fortune in timber. His wife, Clara, was the epitome of reserved grace. Their only son, Arthur, a sensitive young man of 22, had recently returned from his studies in Boston, bringing with him a restless modern energy that seemed to clash with the house's heavy Victorian silence. Their mansion, a hulking structure of dark stone and pointed gables, sat atop the highest knoll, overlooking Fairview like a watchful, judgmental gargoyle. It was a symbol of their success, but lately, the townsfolk saw it as a gilded cage holding a terrifying secret. The fear didn't start with a scream or a ghostly sighting. It began with a smell. A noxious, sweet and sour stench that drifted down from the mansion's grounds on windless nights. Elias Lennox had initially dismissed it as drainage issues, then a dead animal. But the odor persisted, clinging to the heavy, damp air like a shroud. The real shift began a month ago, coinciding with Arthur's return. He had changed. The bright, inquisitive spark in his eyes had been replaced by a vacant, manic intensity. He would pace the house at all hours, his footsteps echoing in the mahogany-lined hallways, occasionally pausing to speak in a rapid, unintelligible murmur. Clara, desperate to shield her son from the town's scrutiny and Elias's growing impatience, claimed it was merely nerves brought on by the pressures of academic life. One particularly oppressive Tuesday, the sky the color of bruised pewter, the family was gathered for dinner. The room was tense, the silver cutlery clinking against the porcelain plates the only sound. Arthur suddenly dropped his fork. It landed with a startling clatter. "They're watching," he stated, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on a shadowed corner of the dining room. "They're waiting for the stain to spread." Elias's jaw tightened. "Arthur, that is enough of this nonsense. You will eat your meal and compose yourself." "You can't see it, Father," Arthur pleaded, leaning forward, his eyes wide and feverish. "The house, it breathes dirt. It feeds on our quiet despair." Clara placed a trembling hand on Arthur's arm. "Please, my dear boy, you are frightening your father." The moment was shattered when Arthur violently recoiled from his mother's touch, scrambling back from the table. "Don't touch me, your hands are covered in it, the sulfur, the rot. It's what you feed him." Elias sprang from his chair, a mixture of shame and fury blazing in his eyes. He grasped his son's shoulders and forcibly marched him out of the room. The muffled, frantic sounds of their argument drifted back down the hallway, punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a door being slammed and locked. The town, already steeped in rumor, seized upon the incident. Mrs. Albright, the cook who had been dismissed a week prior after arguing with Clara over the quality of the pantry stock, was the primary source. She recounted how Arthur had been seen digging in the damp soil behind the greenhouse at midnight, whispering to something unseen. She spoke of secret meetings and unholy books that Arthur had brought back from the city. The community, bound by a stringent and fear-driven moral code of the time, began to interpret Arthur's mental decline through the only lens they understood: sin and damnation. The mysterious smell, the strange behavior, the Lennox's isolation, it all coalesced into a single terrifying concept. The Reverend Thomas Selwyn was a man whose faith bordered on fanaticism. He saw the Lennox's troubles not as a medical or psychological issue, but as a crisis of the soul, a divine message. He called their wealth a wicked vanity, and their mansion a citadel of cold pride. Reverend Selwyn visited the mansion the next day. The air inside felt thick, heavy with the scent of old wood and the lingering sourness Arthur had mentioned. He found Clara in the drawing room, pale and desperate. "Mrs. Lennox," The Reverend stated, his voice low and firm. "Your son is clearly afflicted by a deep malady. A physician will treat the body, but it is the soul that is in peril. There are forces at work here that no doctor can diagnose. Forces of temptation, of spiritual poison." Clara, exhausted by weeks of terror and sleepless nights, nodded weakly, her reserve finally crumbling. "What do you propose, Reverend?" "We have tried everything." Selwyn's eyes, bright with terrifying conviction, swept over the opulent room, settling on the locked door behind which Arthur lay. "We must purge the influence, Mrs. Lennox. We must apply the only effective cure for a soul corrupted by modern vice and spiritual depravity." He took a deep breath, the smell of damp earth and something acrid filling his lungs. "We must perform an exorcism." Elias, upon hearing the proposition, was initially furious, denouncing the idea as medieval superstition. But as Arthur's condition worsened, marked by violent outbursts, self-harm, and increasingly incoherent rants about the fire and the reckoning, Elias's pragmatic, controlled world began to fracture. His fear of social ruin and the public humiliation of his son's perceived madness eventually eclipsed his rational doubts. He had to be seen to be doing something, even if it was drastic. The decision was made. The exorcism would be a private, desperate measure to reclaim their son and their reputation. The Reverend Selwyn and two trusted, equally fervent elders would perform the ritual the following night. They believed they were fighting a demon. In reality, they were simply feeding a terrifying, burgeoning paranoia. The trap was set, not by the devil, but by fear, isolation, and a profound lack of understanding. The dark narrative of the Lennoxes was about to begin its true, chilling descent. Thank you for watching the first part of this harrowing true crime case. To ensure you don't miss the terrifying progression of the Lennox tragedy, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Your support helps us uncover more untold horrors hidden in history. The decision to proceed with the exorcism did little to alleviate the tension. It merely focused the family's pervasive anxiety into a single, terrifying expectation. Elias Lennox, a man who measured his life by ledgers and rational increments, now moved through his house like a sleepwalker, his customary authority replaced by a profound, agonizing uncertainty. He knew intellectually that the Reverend Selwyn's methods bordered on the medieval, but Arthur's escalating episodes of self-mutilation and his frantic paranoid ramblings about hidden rot and infestation had corroded Elias's pragmatic shell. The source of Arthur's fixation remained the unsettling smell. It was stronger now, particularly in the secluded rooms on the mansion's east wing. It was not merely decay, it was an industrial metallic sweetness mixed with the heavy organic scent of damp earth. The scent became the unacknowledged invisible antagonist, weaving itself into the fabric of the family's mounting psychological distress. Reverend Selwyn, accompanied by two church elders, Mr. Peterson and Mr. Doyle, arrived precisely at 8 in the evening. Selwyn carried no crucifixes or holy water, for he was a man of the rigid, puritanical strain, believing in the power of verbal condemnation and physical endurance over mystical artifacts. The ritual was intended to be a brutal confrontation, a forcing of the will. They chose the main study for the event, a room dominated by dark wood, filled with the odor of old paper and the persistent metallic tang. Arthur was already there, having been physically restrained by Elias and Clara after a struggle that left Clara weeping silently, her elegant dress torn at the shoulder. Arthur sat strapped into a high-backed leather chair, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixated on the brass fire grate. He was no longer yelling. He was unnervingly silent, occasionally emitting a soft, dry chuckle. Selwyn began, his voice a low, rhythmic drone, citing passages from the harshest parts of the Old Testament. He focused not on banishment, but on confession and repentance, demanding that Arthur identify the sin that had allowed the spiritual blight to take root. Speak the truth, boy, Selwyn boomed, slamming his heavy hand on the mahogany desk. Name the transgression. Name the hidden vice that festers beneath this gilded shell. Arthur's response was a slow, deliberate movement of his head, turning his gaze from the fireplace to the Reverend. It's in the walls, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Not in me. You burn the wrong thing. The elders leaned in, their faces grim and expectant. Peterson, a man known for his rigid honesty, took a stick of incense and lit it, hoping to mask the room's pervasive stench. The clash of the sickly sweet frankincense with the unknown metallic odor only made the atmosphere heavier. Clara stood near the door, her face a mask of paralyzing guilt. She had always struggled with Elias's ruthlessness in business and his emotional distance, but she had buried her despair beneath meticulous homemaking and societal pretense. Now, under the oppressive weight of Selwyn's accusations of familial sin, she felt the foundation of her entire existence crumbling. The Reverend's words were meant for Arthur, but they lacerated her soul. Elias, standing opposite Selwyn, tried to maintain an air of control, but his hands were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. He was listening not to the religious rhetoric, but to the paranoia in his son's voice. Arthur had always been sensitive, but since returning from the city, he had become obsessed with a vague sense of moral corruption within the family's wealth. The timber, Arthur rasped, his eyes darting to Elias. The money is blood-soaked, father. The wood is rotten at the core, and now the rot is hungry. This struck Elias not as religious delirium, but as a direct accusation related to a very real, hidden conflict, a recent, highly unethical land deal that had financially secured the family, but had involved the deliberate destruction of a poor tenant farmer's property. Only Elias, his foreman, and his lawyer knew the full extent of the deceit. Elias lunged forward, not in religious zeal, but in a panicked attempt to silence a revelation. It is the devil speaking lies through you, Arthur. Lies. Selwyn misinterpreted the move, seeing it as righteous anger against the perceived demonic entity. He signaled to the elders. The exorcism shifted from a verbal interrogation to a physical confrontation. They began to press Arthur, forcing him to remain still, reciting a relentless litany of sin and damnation, pushing him past the brink of sanity and into a state of sheer physical terror. The tension peaked when Arthur, with a terrifying burst of strength, tore one of his leather bindings free. He didn't attack. Instead, he reached into the high-backed chair, fumbling beneath the heavy upholstery where the leather was tacked to the wood. He pulled something out, a small, crudely whittled wooden doll shaped like a stunted, limbless figure, its head wrapped in rusted wire. "The source," Arthur screamed, holding the figure aloft. "The thing they made me hide. The thing that smells like the earth and the metal sickness." He threw it violently into the fireplace grate. It landed with a dull thud. Elias froze, staring at the doll. It wasn't the devil. It was a crude toy, possibly something Arthur had made during a childhood illness. But the way Arthur presented it, the sheer panicked conviction, it seemed to embody the focus of his delusion. Selwyn saw his opportunity. "There is the evidence of your wickedness, boy. A profane idol. We must purify it. We must burn the seed of your torment." In a frenzy of misdirected spiritual fervor, Selwyn snatched a nearby bottle of turpentine, used for cleaning the oil portraits, and poured it liberally over the wooden doll in the grate. The turpentine, combined with the dry paper and accumulated dust, instantly created a volatile chemical reaction. As Selwyn reached for a match, Elias finally snapped out of his trance, horrified. "No! Thomas, stop! That's not a demon, that's my son!" But it was too late. Selwyn struck the match. The grate erupted in a violent yellow flash. The small, localized fire was instantly suffocated by the room's airtightness, causing a billowing cloud of acrid black smoke and a sickening new stench, burning chemicals and old, damp wood to instantly fill the confined space. Arthur, finally freed by the shock, began to laugh, a high, manic, hysterical sound. The reckoning! The fire must cleanse the stain. The real terror was not the fire, but the suffocation and the psychological collapse it triggered. In the smoke-filled room, with Selwyn and the elders coughing and stumbling, the boundaries between Arthur's paranoia and the terrifying reality collapsed for the entire family. The chemical smoke was overwhelming, blurring vision and seizing lungs. Elias, disoriented, choked on the thick smoke. He saw his wife, Clara, sinking to her knees, her face distorted not just by smoke, but by the realization of her own passive complicity in her son's torture. He saw the Reverend Selwyn, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wide with a genuine terror that was far more potent than his earlier conviction. The fire was real, and it was a direct consequence of their collective, fanatic paranoia. The house, which Arthur had claimed breathed dirt, was now attempting to swallow them whole. Thank you for watching the first part of this harrowing true crime case. To ensure you don't miss the terrifying progression of the Lennox tragedy, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Your support helps us uncover more untold horrors hidden in history. The immediate, terrifying fire was quickly suppressed by Elias and the struggling elders, who used heavy rugs to smother the flames in the grate. The immediate danger of the house burning down passed, but the smoke lingered, thick and pungent, a material manifestation of the damage done. The psychological fire, however, had just been ignited. Arthur, his restraints now fully broken, escaped the study, his frantic, desperate laughter echoing down the hallways. He was no longer just paranoid. He was completely unmoored, having been pushed into a catastrophic breakdown by the intensity of the confrontation and the sensory overload of the chemical smoke. Elias stood in the study, gasping for breath, staring at the charred fragments of the small wooden doll. The elders and Selwyn, their faces pale and ashamed, were speechless. They had not banished a demon. They had shattered a man. Elias's controlled fury finally erupted, but it was directed not at the ministers, but at his own weakness and his acceptance of the ridiculous ritual. "Get out!" Elias choked out, pointing a trembling, soot-stained finger at Selwyn. "You brought fire and madness into my home. Your God is a lie. Get out before I send the constables after you for assault." Selwyn and the elders, defeated and terrified of the legal and social repercussions, quickly fled into the night, leaving the Lennoxes alone in the smoking, silent ruin of their study. The house, usually a monument to controlled wealth, now smelled of ash, fear, and that persistent metallic sour odor that seemed to emanate from the very foundation. Clara found Elias slumped in his chair minutes later, his head in his hands. "He's gone, Elias. Arthur." He ran upstairs. "He's locking himself in the laboratory." The laboratory was Arthur's private sanctuary in the East Wing. During his time in Boston, he had become deeply interested in early industrial chemistry and urban sanitation, subjects considered unconventional, if not slightly morbid, in Fairview. He had fitted a small, unused servants' room with rudimentary equipment, glass beakers, titration kits, and bottles of common, yet volatile, chemicals used in early photography and metallurgy. Elias, ignoring his throbbing headache, forced the door open with a brutal kick. The room was dark, but a faint blue-green phosphorescence glowed from a small basin on a workbench. Arthur was huddled in the corner, his knees drawn up, rocking. "Father! Father!" Arthur cried, pointing a shaking finger at the faint glow. "The stain. I found it. It's growing. It's in the soil and the pipes. It wants to eat the copper." Elias looked at the basin. It contained a murky liquid. Arthur had clearly been trying to replicate the smell, mixing various chemicals with water and soil samples. The strange metallic smell was overwhelming here, intensified by the concentration of chemicals and the lack of ventilation. "What is this, Arthur?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice steady, moving carefully towards his son. "It's what the money smells like," Arthur shrieked, scrambling back, his terror real and physical. "It's the poison, the land you bought." They threw it away, but it's still here. It's under the house. Clara, leaning heavily in the doorway, suddenly gasped, not at Arthur's words, but at the realization of what that smell might actually be. She remembered Elias's intense secrecy surrounding the purchase of the land upon which the mansion was built. A purchase made quickly and quietly 10 years prior, displacing the original owner. Elias dismissed Arthur's ravings as pure delusion, a final, twisted manifestation of his breakdown. "It's chemicals, son. You're making yourself sick with these fumes." But Arthur's panic, rooted in his psychological distress, began to overlap with an uncomfortable physical reality for Elias. The land deal had been complicated. It wasn't just a tenant farmer. The previous owner had used a small remote section of the property as a dumping ground for waste from a small defunct local metallurgy workshop that had briefly operated there. The waste, mainly corrosive byproducts and metallic sludge, had been buried and forgotten before Elias acquired the property and built his house. Ignoring the foreman's quiet warnings about the unstable subsoil, Elias had chosen to bury the truth, just as the sludge had been buried. He convinced himself the house's foundation was deep enough. Now, Arthur's constant visceral complaints about the smell and the rot were hammering on Elias's buried guilt and his fear of exposure. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The smell of ash and the pervasive underlying metallic tang of the house were overpowering. He descended into the basement, a cold, dry space that served mostly as storage. He carried a flickering oil lamp. The silence of the basement was usually reassuring, a comforting tomb of his prosperity. But tonight, it was menacing. The smell was strongest here, concentrated and sharp. Elias approached the stone foundation wall near the east wing, precisely under Arthur's laboratory. He held the lamp close to the wall. The stone was solid, but running along the bottom seam where the wall met the packed earth floor, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A faint, greenish efflorescence, crusty and crystalline, that seemed to seep from the mortar. It was the same color as the liquid Arthur had made glow in the lab. It wasn't a demon. It wasn't a spiritual stain. It was chemical contamination, slowly wicking its way up through the foundation stone, reacting with the damp earth, releasing noxious fumes that were likely small, consistent doses of vapors. A real, physical poison that had been silently leaching into the house's lower atmosphere for years. Arthur, with his sensitive disposition and amateur chemical knowledge, had been the first to notice the effects. The constant exposure, combined with the extreme psychological pressure of his social isolation and his father's expectations, had tipped him into psychosis and physical sickness. His obsession with the stain was a horrifyingly accurate reflection of a physical threat. Elias ran his finger over the crusty green growth. His breathing hitched. He finally understood the terrifying reality. He had not built his fortune on timber. He had built his house on poison. He had forced his son to live in a gilded cage that was slowly, chemically breaking him. The chilling reality was that the exorcism had only accelerated the tragic result, forcing the psychological collapse. The terror was now entirely real and material. Elias had to stop the source. He had to prove to Arthur and to himself that the nightmare had a physical, fixable origin. The mystery was solved, but the horror was just beginning. The discovery of the crystalline efflorescence in the basement provided Elias Lennox with a terrible clarity, replacing his spiritual anxiety with a ruthless, desperate pragmatism. He was not battling a curse. He was battling industrial waste and the toxic consequences of his own buried secrets. The metallic smell was the smell of poison, not of sin. The immediate problem was Arthur, who was now utterly convinced the house was actively sentient and consuming them. The second problem was the secrecy. If the town learned that the esteemed Lennox mansion was built on a toxic dump, a revelation that would ruin his reputation and likely face legal consequences. It would be a public disaster. Elias resolved to contain the problem, both physically and socially, entirely within the house's walls. He descended to the basement the next morning, equipped with a pickaxe and a wheelbarrow. He had to dig, to expose the source of the leaching and attempt to seal or remove the contaminated soil. It was a monumental, solitary task that became his new, obsessive ritual. Clara, seeing her husband engaged in manual labor, sweaty and stained, was filled with a fresh wave of paralyzing despair. Elias was usually so pristine, so removed from the physical realities of the world. Now he looked like a madman, tunneling beneath his own home. "Elias, stop this," she pleaded, standing at the top of the basement stairs, clutching a small, embroidered handkerchief to her nose. "You will collapse. We need to hire men, or better yet, we need to leave. Sell the house. Move to the city." Elias drove the pickaxe into the packed earth floor with a violent grunt. "No. I will not be driven out of my own house by a patch of dirt, Clara. This is my failure, and I will fix it myself. No one is to know, not the lawyers, not the workers. They will use this against us." His refusal to seek help was rooted in his lifelong controlling paranoia about social standing. He viewed any external involvement as an immediate threat to his carefully constructed identity. The house itself became a terrifying symbol of his ego. If the house was poisoned, then his entire life was a lie. He spent the entire day digging. The soil, just a few feet down, became noticeably darker, wetter, and the chemical smell intensified to a dizzying, suffocating degree. He began to unearth lumps of hardened metallic sludge, dark green and black, embedded in the clay. Arthur had been right. The rot was real. Upstairs, Arthur was deteriorating rapidly. He refused to eat, instead spending his time meticulously examining the floorboards and the walls, scratching at them with a hidden nail file, convinced he could hear the poison breathing. His sickness was not just psychological. The fumes rising from the basement through the ventilation system were real and debilitating. The nausea, the headaches, the respiratory irritation, all real symptoms that fueled his delusional belief that he was being persecuted by the house itself. Clara, caught between her husband's desperate secrecy and her son's terrifying sickness, felt her own sanity fraying. She had always relied on Elias's strength, but now his strength was being used to conceal and prolong the danger. The climax of this chapter came late that night. Elias, exhausted and dizzy from the noxious fumes, stumbled up the stairs, his clothes covered in toxic sludge. He found Clara standing outside Arthur's locked door, sobbing quietly. "He's writing," she whispered, pointing to the crack beneath the door where a narrow strip of paper had been pushed out. Elias picked it up. It was Arthur's precise academic handwriting, but the words were filled with a cold, terrifying finality. "I understand now. The stain is not merely beneath the foundations, it is in the wood itself. The pressure is building. The walls are not holding. The only way to stop the poison from spreading and to prevent the entire community from being infected by Father's tainted wealth is to stop the breathing." The fire was a sign. The house must be purified. Elias stared at the note, the words chilling him far more than any fear of ghosts. Arthur was not just psychotic. He was acting with a terrifying, distorted logic. He had decided that the only solution to the real physical contamination, a solution which his father was desperately, secretly trying to fix, was destruction. Elias rushed to the door, pounding on the heavy wood. "Arthur, stop this. I know what the smell is. I am digging it out. It is just chemicals, son. It is not the house." Silence. Then a low, unnerving sound from inside, the scraping sound of metal against wood, followed by the unmistakable sharp smell of kerosene, the fuel used for the lamps and the furnace. Clara screamed, "He's going to burn his books! He's going to burn everything!" Elias, his mind reeling from the basement fumes, his body shaking with fatigue, finally realized the depth of the tragedy. He had solved the material mystery. the chemical contamination. But in his desperate attempt to conceal it, he had allowed his son's psychological deterioration to reach its final lethal stage. The exorcism had planted the seed of the purifying fire in Arthur's mind, and now the contamination had given him the motive and the means. Elias frantically searched the hallway for the spare key to the room, his heart pounding against his ribs. The chemical smell, the kerosene, the smoke from the previous night, it all merged into a single choking premonition. The tragic climax, born of fear, secrecy, and real-world poison, was inevitable. The thick, oily smell of kerosene pouring beneath the door of the laboratory was the final devastating sensory clue that shattered Elias's remaining composure. The threat was no longer a secret to be contained, but an immediate, life-threatening emergency. Clara. The axe. The service axe in the mudroom. Hurry! Elias roared, slamming his shoulder against the heavy oak door. The door frame was solid, reinforced by years of Victorian construction. It wouldn't break easily. Clara, her face contorted with panic, stumbled down the grand staircase, her expensive slippers slipping on the polished wood. She was no longer the reserved, elegant mistress of the house. She was a terrified woman whose world had collapsed into fire and fear. Elias continued to beat on the door, screaming Arthur's name. "Son, I'm coming in. Listen to me. It is not a judgment. It is my mistake. I built the house on bad land. I am sorry." Inside, Arthur was moving with a feverish, focused intensity. His psychosis, previously erratic, had coalesced into a single monomaniacal purpose: to stop the breathing and cleanse the taint by fire. The kerosene, an ordinary household chemical, was now his holy water. He had overturned his lab bench, soaking his notebooks, beakers, and, most crucially, the floorboards in the corner closest to the basement ventilation shaft. He was murmuring to himself a chilling litany of purification. The heat is the only cure. The metal must be melted away. The stain must be lifted. When Clara returned, panting with the small, dull axe, Elias snatched it and began hacking at the door lock and jamb with brutal, disorganized strokes. The heavy wood splintered, the noise echoing through the silent mansion, a violent, desperate symphony of destruction. Suddenly, Arthur stopped his work. He turned toward the door, his eyes wide, no longer seeing his father but a final obstacle to the necessary cleansing. "You will not stop the cure," Arthur screamed, his voice breaking with manic conviction. He rushed to the fireplace grate, the site of the mock exorcism, and grabbed the charred, partially burned remnants of the wooden doll. It was his perverse, powerful totem of the contamination. Just as the door finally gave way with a massive crack and a shower of splinters, Elias burst in, followed by Clara. The sight was devastating. The air was thick with the chemical smell and the kerosene, and Arthur was standing with a box of long sulfur matches, the kind used for lighting the hearth, poised over the kerosene-soaked floor. "Arthur, no." Elias lunged forward, but the floor was dangerously slippery with the kerosene. He slipped, his already exhausted body failing him. Clara, fueled by maternal instinct, rushed past him. "My son, please, no more fire." She seized Arthur's arm, not to stop him but to hold him, to plead with him. It was a terrible, fated collision. Arthur, mistaking his mother's desperate embrace for another attempt to stop his cure, struggled violently. He tore free of her grasp, but in the violent thrash, the hand holding the matchbox was knocked against the wall. The entire box of sulfur matches ignited instantly in a single sputtering flash, showering sparks directly onto the kerosene-soaked floor. The resulting ignition was not a slow burn, but an instantaneous roaring whoosh of flame and heat that engulfed the immediate area of the corner, cutting off the doorway. Clara screamed a sharp, piercing sound that was immediately stifled by the smoke and the heat. She was closest to the epicenter, the hem of her long skirt catching fire immediately. Elias, momentarily stunned on the slick floor, saw the horrific reality. The fire was real, it was fierce, and it was exactly what his son had intended. Arthur, standing amidst the flames he had summoned, did not appear terrified. He appeared relieved. His psychotic mission was complete. "The purification is begun," Arthur shrieked, his face strangely calm as the intense heat began to blister the paint on the walls. "It must be done. The house is weeping fire." The fire, fueled by the wood, the dry paper, and the chemical residue in the room, spread with terrifying speed, rapidly consuming the heavy draperies and climbing the wooden paneling. Elias scrambled back, pulling Clara with him. Her skirt was fully alight and she was already choking on the thick black smoke. They were trapped between the intense, roaring flames and the broken doorway. The terrible realism of the situation descended upon Elias. He was not fighting a supernatural force, but the devastating physical consequences of a house fire. The heat was unbearable, the smoke paralyzing. He had failed to save his son from his psychosis, and now they were all paying the price. He dragged Clara into the hallway, away from the immediate inferno. Arthur remained inside, a silent, burning silhouette against the backdrop of the inferno. Elias knew with sickening certainty that his son had committed a final, horrific act of self-immolation in the sincere, warped belief that he was saving the world from the poison. The fire, now fully established, began to roar. Elias dragged Clara, whose skin was already badly burned, toward the main staircase. He had to get them out. The house, which had symbolized his family's security and pride, was now a funeral pyre, fueled by industrial waste, mental illness, and unforgivable secrecy. The story of the Lennox family, a tragedy of psychological horror and chemical contamination, had reached its irreversible, destructive climax. The horrifying end the town would soon witness was not an exorcism gone wrong, but the terrifying conclusion of a family tragedy born of human failings. The roaring fire in the East Wing quickly began to consume the great Lennox mansion. The house's old, dry timber and the lack of internal fire breaks, common in grand Victorian architecture, meant the flames spread rapidly through the walls and up toward the roof. Elias Lennox, his face scorched and blackened, dragged his severely injured wife, Clara, down the main staircase. The air in the central hall was already turning thick and black. Clara was barely conscious, her breath shallow and rattled. Elias knew they had mere minutes before the house became entirely impassable. He managed to pull her through the massive front doors and collapse with her onto the dew-damp lawn. The cool night air hit him like a shock, momentarily clearing the smoke from his lungs, but not the terror from his mind. He looked back at the house, a monumental structure now glowing with an internal hellish light, the windows in the East Wing already cracking and bursting from the intense heat. Arthur was gone, consumed by the consequence of his delusion and his father's denial. Elias, despite the agony of his burns and the overwhelming despair, knew he had to establish a narrative, a final, necessary lie to protect his reputation and, he desperately hoped, Clara's dignity. The truth, that he had built his fortune and his home on a secret deposit of toxic waste that drove his son to psychosis and murder-suicide, was unthinkable. He lifted his head just as the first flicker of movement caught his eye. Across the lawn, partially obscured by the thick encroaching fog and the shadows cast by the rapidly growing firelight, stood a figure. It was a man, short, stocky, and cloaked in a dark, practical overcoat. He was not a neighbor. He was too far away, and his posture was too still, too observant. It was Mr. Harris, Elias's former foreman, the man who had quietly warned him about the unstable subsoil and the chemical waste 10 years earlier. Harris had been summarily dismissed shortly after the foundation was laid, a casualty of Elias's ruthless secrecy. Elias's blood ran cold, a terror far sharper than the fire. Harris was the only other person alive who knew the truth about the land. and he had seen the final fiery result of Elias's arrogance and denial. Harris was an unseen witness, a walking threat to the carefully constructed narrative Elias was about to unleash. Harris stood there for a long, silent moment, the firelight illuminating the grim, unchanging expression on his face, a look of cold, grim validation. He didn't approach. He didn't yell. He simply watched the fire consume the Lennox pride, then turned and vanished silently into the mist. The sound of the first approaching fire wagon's bell, faint in the distance, shattered the moment. Elias instantly refocused, forcing his mind into survival mode. He had to act before the authorities, the town, and the press arrived. He leaned over Clara, who was faintly trying to gasp for air. He needed a story that was simple, dramatic, and absolute. When the first volunteer fireman arrived, followed quickly by the town constable, they found Elias Lennox holding his wife, sitting amidst the wreckage of their life, pointing a trembling, soot-covered finger back toward the roaring blaze. Elias, summoning a false depth of grief and conviction, provided his carefully constructed lie, a narrative designed to absolve him of all responsibility and to place the entire tragedy squarely on the shoulders of fanatical superstition. "It was the exorcism," Elias cried out, his voice raw with a manufactured agony. "Reverend Selwyn and his elders, they went too far. They tormented my boy, convinced him he was possessed. They filled the room with foul smoke and he went mad. He believed the fire would cleanse him. He took the kerosene and destroyed himself. And Clara, she tried to stop him." The constable, already informed of the presence of the Reverend and his cohorts at the mansion earlier that evening, absorbed the story immediately. It fit the era's anxiety about religious fanaticism, providing an easy, dramatic, and instantly understandable villain: the zealous church. The true complex terror of chemical poisoning and mental illness was instantly buried beneath the simpler, more sensational horror of religious extremism. The townsfolk, fearful and easily swayed, would accept this narrative completely. As Elias was loaded onto a stretcher alongside his severely burned wife, he looked back at the house, now a raging inferno, a pillar of fire and smoke against the night sky. The fire was destroying the evidence: the laboratory, the kerosene-soaked floorboards, and the toxic deposits in the basement, soon to be buried under tons of rubble and water. The fire that claimed the Lennox family was a physical, material disaster, but it was set by a psychological bomb planted by a father's relentless secrecy and detonated by a son's psychotic conviction. Elias Lennox had survived the flames, but he was forever trapped, consumed by the knowledge of the truth and the terrifying possibility that the silent figure in the mist, Mr. Harris, might one day return to expose the true, horrifying stain beneath the mansion's foundation. The story of the chilling exorcism was now etched in the town's memory, a terrible lie that would forever obscure the greater, more insidious truth. The destruction of the Lennox mansion became the defining tragedy of Fairview, 1903. The physical ruins were still smoking days later, a stark skeletal outline of stone and charred wood against the skyline. But the most immediate damage was done to the town's social fabric. Elias Lennox's public narrative that the Reverend Selwyn's fanaticism drove his son to a fire-based suicide and severely injured his wife was accepted with terrifying speed. The story resonated with the community's underlying anxieties about religious extremism and the perceived cruelty of certain puritanical sects. The immediate aftermath saw a rapid, vicious social and legal dismantling of Reverend Selwyn. He and the two elders were immediately arrested, charged with involuntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment. The public outrage was fueled by Elias's calculated display of grief and his influential standing. The narrative was simple and potent. The wealthy, respected family destroyed by the medieval, misplaced zeal of the church. In the hospital, Elias sat by Clara's bedside. She was alive, but barely, suffering from critical burns and severe smoke inhalation. She was in a constant, drug-induced twilight, occasionally surfacing to a brief, terrified lucidity. During one of these fleeting moments, Clara's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Elias, her gaze clear but filled with a profound, terrifying sadness that cut through his carefully constructed lies. "Elias," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound. "The smell. It wasn't the devil. It was the earth. We shouldn't have built here. We shouldn't have listened to the Reverend. It was your secret, Elias. It was your money that burned Arthur." Her words, though fragmented and almost inaudible, struck Elias like a physical blow. He realized that while Clara had been complicit in the social pretense, she had understood in those final horrifying minutes the real source of their destruction. The physical poison born of Elias's greed and secrecy. Her survival was not a relief. It was a constant, living threat to his meticulously crafted lie. Elias, fighting his panic, gently stroked her soot-stained hand. "Rest, my dear. It was the fever talking. It was the devil's work on Arthur. He is gone now. We are safe." But they were not safe. The town was focused on the trials, but the police investigation into the fire was running concurrently. Constable Henry Miller, a quiet man with a meticulous eye for detail, was not entirely satisfied with Elias's dramatic account. Miller focused on the physical evidence, not the melodrama. Miller visited Elias at the hospital to take his final, official statement. He brought with him a single, simple piece of evidence retrieved from the wreckage. A severely burned but still recognizable fragment of the wooden doll Arthur had thrown into the fire. "Mr. Lennox," Miller said quietly, holding the fragment wrapped in a clean cloth. "You claimed the Reverend started the fire, but the fire began on the floor, in the corner, not in the grate. The smell in that part of the house, even now, is not just wood smoke and kerosene. It's metallic. It's unlike anything I've ever smelled." Elias's practiced composure began to crack. He felt the cold pressure of exposure closing in. "The Reverend brought in chemicals, I told you. He was trying to exorcise something." Miller shook his head slowly. "The Reverend testified they used only incense and turpentine, which they found in your study, not the lab. And the fire, Mr. Lennox, originated precisely above a ventilation shaft that ran down to your basement. A shaft that, according to witnesses, your son spent much time examining." Miller placed the doll fragment on the table, then leaned in. "I went to the basement, sir, before the rain and the fire hoses flooded it. I found evidence of recent digging. Large amounts of disturbed earth mixed with a strange dark metallic sludge near the foundation of the east wing." Elias stared at the constable, his face drained of color. He had survived the fire, but he was trapped by the material reality of his crime. The constable, ignoring the sensational drama of the exorcism, had followed the physical, chemical trail of the true horror. Miller's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. "Tell me, Mr. Lennox, what exactly were you trying to bury down there?" Elias looked at his critically injured wife, who was mercifully unconscious again. He looked at the window, beyond which the ruined shell of his life stood. He knew he could not implicate himself without destroying Clara and everything he had built. He had to stand by his original lie, no matter the cost. "Constable," Elias said, locking eyes with Miller, his voice suddenly hard and final. "You are confusing cause with effect. My son was driven mad by the fear the Reverend put in him. He was digging because the demon told him to. The smell, the chemicals, the madness. It was all the result of the exorcism. You have your culprits. Do your duty." Elias had made his final choice, to sacrifice the truth, to condemn the innocent ministers, and to live forever with the knowledge that he had driven his son to death and his wife to near-fatal injury, all to protect his reputation and his toxic secret. The story was closed for the public, but the terror, the fear of Harris, the suspicion of Miller, and the knowledge in Clara's eyes would follow Elias for the rest of his tormented life. We've reached a critical turning point in the tragic story of the Lennox family. The truth is now buried, but the consequences are only beginning for Elias. If you are gripped by the mystery and the psychological horror of this case, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. Help us ensure these buried stories see the light. The trial of Reverend Selwyn and the two elders became a spectacle. Elias Lennox, still physically scarred but impeccably dressed in black, was the star witness. He delivered his testimony with a controlled passion, painting a vivid, harrowing picture of the minister's fanatical intrusion and their role in pushing his already sensitive son Arthur over the edge. The defense attorney tried to introduce the concept of mental instability and the unexplained chemical odors, but Elias shut down any line of questioning that pointed toward the structural integrity of the house or his own past land dealings. He skillfully redirected all suspicion back to the medieval cruelty of the religious figures. The town, reeling from the sensational tragedy and eager for a simple explanation, sided overwhelmingly with the bereaved patriarch. Selwyn and the elders were convicted, their lives ruined, sent to prison for manslaughter. Elias had achieved his goal. The truth of the toxic foundation and his financial deceit was buried deeper than the wreckage of his home. The chilling exorcism narrative was cemented in the local history. However, Elias's victory was a hollow psychological torment. He was now wealthy, safe from exposure, but utterly isolated. Clara remained hospitalized for months, her physical recovery slow and agonizing, her psychological state worse. She remained silent, withdrawn, but her eyes held that chilling knowledge, the truth that poison, not possession, had destroyed their family. One afternoon, visiting Clara, Elias found a simple, unmarked wooden box on her bedside table. It contained Arthur's few remaining personal effects, salvaged from a safe room: a pair of spectacles, a stiff leather wallet, and a collection of handwritten notes that had miraculously survived the fire and the water damage. Elias, with a suffocating sense of dread, opened the notes. They were Arthur's private journals from the last few weeks of his life, filled not with religious or demonic imagery, but with chemical observations. Date: October the 14th. The metallic smell is stronger tonight. The titration attempts confirm the presence of a heavy alkaline salt reacting with the damp soil. It is rising. It is volatile. The pressure is building in the walls. The foreman's warnings were not superstitious. Father, built on a known problem. He sold us for his profit. Date: October 20th. The exposure has made me sensitive. I see the green crystallization in the mortar. The vapor is the breathing. No one else hears it. The Reverend thinks it is temptation. He is wrong. It is material consequence. The cure is not prayer. The cure is total destruction to stop the spread. The whole organism must be purged. Reading the notes was like a physical reenactment of the tragedy. Arthur's mind had not simply gone mad. It had taken a real, physical threat and translated it into a terrifying, yet tragically logical solution. The fire was not a suicidal whim. It was a perceived moral and chemical necessity to save the community from his father's toxic legacy. Elias burned the notes instantly in the hospital fireplace, watching his son's final, damning truth curl into ash. The relief was immediate and cold. Another piece of the truth, destroyed. But the real threat, the unseen witness, remained. Constable Miller, though he could not legally overturn the court's verdict, quietly continued his private inquiries into Elias's land deal. He had located the old county property records, which detailed the prior ownership of the land by the defunct Fairview Metallurgical Company. Miller's suspicion, a quiet, insistent hum in the background of Elias's life, never faded. The greatest psychological strain came from Mr. Harris, the former foreman. Harris never came forward. He never spoke to the police or the press. But Elias knew he was out there. One bleak winter morning, Elias received a small, unmarked package at his temporary residence. Inside was a single dark photographic plate, an early type of positive image. It was a clear, sharp picture taken at night, illuminated by a terrible, blazing light. The photograph showed the Lennox mansion engulfed in flames. And in the foreground, sharp and undeniable, was the silhouette of Elias Lennox, standing next to his collapsing wife. And across the lawn, watching the destruction with an expression of cold judgment, was the figure of Harris. The image was a silent, terrifying demand. Harris was not interested in justice or exposure, but in retribution. He knew the truth, and now Elias knew that Harris had proof. Elias had saved his reputation, but he had bought a life sentence of paranoia and blackmail. He was wealthy, but his every move, every decision, would now be dictated by the silent, judging presence of the man in the mist. The terror was complete. The fire had consumed his family, and now the secret would consume his life. The arrival of the photograph marked the beginning of Elias Lennox's true psychological descent. The image was a materialization of his worst fear, not just exposure, but complete loss of control. Mr. Harris hadn't wanted to prove a point. He wanted to own Elias. The immediate terror gave way to the cold, rational assessment of a businessman under threat. Elias knew he could not call the police. That would mean explaining why Harris had this photograph, and why Harris was the only person who knew the truth about the land. The lie was his cage, and Harris held the key. A second package arrived days later, containing only a hand-drawn map. It was a crude but detailed sketch of the old, neglected service road leading to the isolated Blackwood Mill, long abandoned since the collapse of the local timber trade. Beneath the drawing was a single, chilling instruction, written in a spidery, precise hand. Come alone. Midnight. Elias, despite his fear, felt a surge of his old, ruthless pragmatism. He would meet Harris, assess the cost of his silence, and pay it, whatever the price. It was the only way to reassert a semblance of control over his own life. He left Clara in the care of a private nurse, telling her he had urgent business in the city. He drove his carriage alone, the route taking him away from the town, past the charred, silent ruins of his mansion, a monument to his downfall. The Blackwood Mill was a skeleton of damp, rotten wood, smelling of mildew and decay, a place that mirrored the moral state of Elias's life. He found Harris standing beneath the skeletal frame of the old water wheel, illuminated by the harsh, cold light of a rising moon. Harris was silent, his face inscrutable. He held the single photograph in his hand. "How much?" Elias demanded, his voice thin and sharp in the cold air. "The price for your silence. Name it." Harris looked at the burning ember of his cigar, then back at Elias. "It's not about money, Mr. Lennox." Elias scoffed, his fear turning to impatience. "Don't insult me, Harris. Everything is about money. Is it 1,000, 5,000, enough to leave this miserable town and start anew?" Harris slowly shook his head. "You don't understand. You destroyed my life when you fired me. You ignored my warnings about that land. You built your luxury on poison and ruined your own son. You think a few $1,000s can fix that?" He crushed the cigar under his boot, the smell of burnt tobacco momentarily mixing with the damp mill air. "I want to own you, Lennox. I want to see you live the life you should have had, a life of debt." Harris then laid out his terms, and they were far more psychologically devastating than any monetary demand. He didn't want a lump sum. He wanted a constant, draining siphon of Elias's wealth and control. First, Elias was to settle the lawsuits against the convicted Reverend Selwyn and the elders. But secretly, he was to fund their families, ensure their comfort in prison, and begin the long, quiet process of a private, anonymous appeal to overturn their wrongful convictions. Elias was forced to pay for the justice of the men he had framed. Second, Elias was to fund a large anonymous donation to establish a new Fairview public health clinic focused on diagnosing and treating illnesses caused by industrial pollution. A direct, public-facing acknowledgement of the true crime that had killed his son, yet without ever admitting the source. Finally, Harris demanded a monthly stipend, a large one, delivered in cash, at a different location each month, for the rest of Elias's life. "This is not charity, Lennox," Harris said, his voice hard. "This is the rent for the truth. Every month you will remember what your secret cost you, and you will remember that I am the only thing keeping you out of prison and a lunatic asylum." Elias was cornered. He could not refuse. The thought of losing his entire life's work, his reputation, and facing the truth in a courtroom, where he would have to admit his complicity in Arthur's death, was a far greater terror than this crippling permanent debt. "I agree," Elias finally choked out, the words tasting like ash. "But if you ever try to contact my wife, or if you ever make this public, I will use every resource I have to ruin you, regardless of the consequences to myself." Harris gave a thin, chilling smile. "You don't have to worry, Mr. Lennox. I'm not a murderer. I'm a debt collector. And you, sir, are in debt for the rest of your life." He tossed the photograph onto the damp ground, then turned and walked away. Elias stood alone at the mill, the silence complete, except for the dripping water. He had survived the fire, the police, and the trial, but he had traded his freedom for his lie. His life was now a constant, agonizing performance, controlled by a man in the shadows. The terror was not over. It had merely become a perpetual, quiet arrangement. The years following the fire were a masterclass in controlled, prosperous agony for Elias Lennox. He moved to the city, purchasing a stately, sterile home far from the toxic memories of Fairview. He became a generous, anonymous philanthropist, quietly funding the families of the imprisoned ministers and establishing the public health clinic, exactly as Harris had demanded. The town of Fairview remembered the chilling exorcism as a tragic horror, never connecting the generous donations to the man who caused the crime. Clara remained his constant, silent torment. Her physical recovery stalled, leaving her partially paralyzed and perpetually dependent on Elias. She rarely spoke, but her lucid moments were spent staring at him with a profound, unblinking sorrow that embodied the truth he had buried. Their interactions were a silent, unbearable punishment. Elias fulfilled Harris's terms meticulously. Every month, a large, untraceable sum of cash was delivered to a new, pre-arranged drop-off point. A train station locker, a church pew, a hollow in an old oak tree. The monthly ritual was a constant fresh wound, a reminder that he was no longer a free man. The physical wreckage of the Lennox mansion remained for a surprisingly long time. No one wanted to buy the cursed land. The town, steeped in the false narrative, avoided the site, the charred shell standing as a stark warning against spiritual arrogance. Constable Miller retired a few years later, quietly leaving a sealed report detailing his suspicions about the metallic sludge and the land sale in the county archives. It was a time capsule of the truth, waiting for a future generation to uncover the chemical reality behind the sensational ghost story. The final, climactic twist in Elias's torment arrived a decade later, when he received a delivery, not of cash, but of a small, lacquered wooden box. Inside was a single, folded sheet of paper and a key. The paper contained a final typed note from Mr. Harris. "Mr. Lennox, the debt is paid. I am done with you. My intention was never to ruin you entirely, but to ensure that you spent the second half of your life rebuilding what your greed destroyed. The men are free. The truth is being slowly addressed by the clinic, and you have paid the rent for 10 years. The house is still standing. It is a constant reminder of what a secret costs. The key is for the safe deposit box at the First National Bank in Fairview. I have never used it. It contains the original photograph and my detailed written account of the land purchase, the warnings, and your confession. It is set to be automatically opened by the bank manager upon my death, or your permanent disappearance. It is your ultimate insurance policy. It guarantees your continued good behavior. I hope you enjoy your freedom. It is now entirely in your hands." Elias sank into his chair, the note slipping from his fingers. He was finally free from the monthly torment of Harris, yet utterly bound by the knowledge of the safe deposit box. Harris had ensured that Elias's freedom was conditional, a perpetual sword of Damocles hanging over his head. Elias could never disappear, never reveal the truth, and never stop paying the metaphorical price. His life became a desolate, controlled existence. He continued his anonymous philanthropy, compelled by a genuine, agonizing remorse that was born of fear. He continued to care for Clara, whose silence was the most damning testimony of all. He was rich, powerful, and respected, but he was trapped in a self-made prison of paranoia and guilt. Years passed. Elias grew old, his hair turning the color of ash. He became obsessed with the thought of the safe deposit box, the physical evidence of his crime, hidden miles away in a dusty vault. The lie that had saved his life was the same thing that was now consuming his soul. One cold evening, sitting alone by the fire, Elias looked at Clara. She was sleeping peacefully, her ravaged face softened by the dim light. He realized he had achieved a terrifying form of success. He had kept his secret, saved his money, and condemned his family to a life of quiet suffering. He died in that chair, quietly, the following morning alone. The safe deposit box, opened upon his death, was never publicly revealed. Elias's son, Arthur, was remembered in Fairview as the poor victim of a chilling exorcism, a cautionary tale against religious fanaticism. The truth, that he was poisoned, driven mad by his father's toxic greed, and committed murder-suicide in a final, frantic, logical attempt at purification, remained buried beneath the city's archive dust, a true crime of chemical consequence and psychological terror, hidden by a sensational lie. The story of the Lennox family is a testament to the chilling, destructive power of secrecy, paranoia, and the material consequences of human greed, proving that the most horrifying monsters are not ghosts or demons, but the real-world evils we bury beneath our foundations.